The day Alex, my son's friend, came over was a whirlwind. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun streams through the living room windows just right, and the quiet hum of the TV fills the house. I was looking forward to a peaceful weekend with Ben away on his camping trip. Little did I know, tranquility was the last thing on the menu. The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone. Setting my glass of wine down, I headed to the door and opened it to find Alex standing there. He was tall, with a lean build and a mop of unruly brown hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes. He had this easygoing charm, a disarming smile that made everyone feel comfortable. "Hey, Mrs. Anderson," he said, that familiar grin spreading across his face. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Alex. Come on in," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Ben mentioned you might stop by. He said you needed something for the camping trip?" "Yeah, about that," he said, a sheepish look creeping onto his face. "I seem to have left my sleeping bag at home. Ben said he might have a spare, but I didn't realize he'd already left." "Oh, typical Ben," I chuckled, shaking my head. "He probably does have a spare. Let's go check the garage." As we walked through the house, I couldn't help but notice how much Alex had changed since I'd last seen him. He'd filled out, his shoulders broader, his frame more defined. There was a newfound confidence in his stride, a quiet strength that radiated from him. We reached the garage, a cluttered space filled with camping gear, old boxes, and Ben's collection of sports equipment. I started rummaging through a pile of sleeping bags until I found a spare. "Here you go," I said, handing it to him. "Ben won't mind." "Thanks, Mrs. Anderson," he said, his smile genuine. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "You, mind if I hang out for a bit? My ride's not coming for another hour, and I'd rather not just sit in the car." "Of course not," I said. "Come on back inside. I just made some coffee." We settled in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Alex leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, as we chatted about his classes, his summer plans, and the upcoming camping trip. He was easy to talk to, his words thoughtful and engaging. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a lingering gaze that held more than just friendly interest. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to my imagination, but the feeling persisted. When he reached for his mug, his fingers brushed against mine, sending a jolt of warmth through me. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back quickly. "It's fine," I replied, forcing a chuckle. "I'm just clumsy." But the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. I busied myself with the coffee, trying to ignore the strange flutter in my chest. "This is Alex, Ben's best friend," I reminded myself. "This is not happening." "Mrs. Anderson," he said, breaking the silence, his voice softer now. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure, Alex," I replied, turning to face him. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting mine again. "Have you ever felt like you wanted something you knew you shouldn't?" The question caught me off guard, and my pulse quickened. "That's a pretty heavy question, Alex," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He gave a small, self-conscious laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, sorry. I guess I've just been thinking about it a lot lately." There was something in his tone, an honesty, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to understand what was going on in his mind, but I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. "Sometimes we want things that aren't good for us," I said carefully. "It's human nature, but that doesn't mean we have to act on them." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, I guess you're right." But the way he looked at me after he said it, the flicker of something in his eyes, the way his lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say more, left me unsettled. I turned back to the coffee pot, hoping the simple act of pouring another cup would give me something to focus on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure if it was something I could ignore. The coffee sat untouched between us as the conversation dwindled. I could feel Alex's presence like a weight, every subtle movement magnified in the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't normal either. It was charged, like something unsaid hung in the air, waiting to break. Alex leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, and I caught myself glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. His shirt lifted just enough to reveal a strip of taut, tanned skin, and I immediately looked away, my face warming. This is ridiculous, I thought. Get a grip. So, I said, breaking the silence, are you excited about the camping trip? He shrugged, his lips curving into a small smile. Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's more for Ben, really. He loves that kind of stuff. I'm just there for the company. His words made me smile. That sounds like you, always looking out for him. You've been a great friend to Ben over the years. Alex looked down at his fingers, toying with the edge of his mug. He's been a good friend to me too, he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, You've been good to me too. There it was again, that softness in his tone, the unspoken layers behind his words. My chest tightened as I searched his face for some clue about what he was trying to say, but he didn't meet my gaze. I just mean, he continued, you've always made me feel welcome, like part of the family. That's not something I take for granted. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Well, you are part of the family, Alex. At least, that's how I see it. He smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Thanks, Mrs. Anderson, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, You can call me Alex, you know. The Mrs. Anderson thing feels too formal. I chuckled. All right, Alex, but only if you stop calling me Mrs. Anderson. Deal? Deal, he said, his grin widening just enough to ease some of the tension in the room. We moved into the living room after that, settling onto the couch. The sun had set, and the soft glow of the table lamp cast warm shadows across the room. Alex sat at the far end of the couch, his posture relaxed, but his eyes focused on me. Can I ask you something? He said, after a long stretch of silence. Of course, I replied, bracing myself for another loaded question. Have you ever felt like, he began, then paused, searching for the right words. Like there was something you couldn't say out loud, even though you really wanted to? I frowned, caught off guard by the question. I think everyone feels that way at some point, I said carefully. But sometimes saying it out loud is the only way to move forward. Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. Yeah, he said softly. But what if saying it changes everything? His words sent a chill down my spine. Though I couldn't say why, I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how close we were. Even with the space between us, I could feel the pull between us. Sometimes change is a good thing, I said, trying to keep my tone steady, even if it's scary at first. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. What if it's not? The weight of his gaze was almost too much, and I found myself looking away, unsure of how to navigate the sudden shift in our conversation. I guess it depends on what you're afraid of, I replied. Alex didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm afraid of ruining this, of ruining what we have. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my heart clench. Alex? I started, but he quickly cut me off. Never mind, he said, standing abruptly. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen him do 1,000,000 times. I should probably go. My ride's probably close by now. I stood too, instinctively reaching out to stop him. My hand closed around his arm, and he froze, his eyes widening as he looked down at where we touched. You don't have to go, I said, my voice soft. Not if you don't want to. Alex's gaze lifted to meet mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, electric, like the moment before a storm. Then, he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice trembling. I just know I don't want to leave. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't name. Fear, confusion, longing. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. "Alex," I said, my voice barely audible. "We can't." "I know," he whispered, "but I can't help it." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark, an undeniable pull that left me frozen in place. I wanted to step back, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into the moment, my heart pounding in my chest. And then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. My mind screamed at me to pull away, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place. As the kiss deepened, the world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us in the dimly lit living room. Alex's breath was shallow, his hand hovering near mine, as if he was unsure whether to pull away or come closer. The kiss lingered, heavy with unspoken emotions. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us in that dimly lit living room. Alex's breath was shallow, his hand hovering near mine, as if unsure whether to pull away or come closer. I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped back abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he blurted, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to. I don't know what I was thinking." My chest felt tight, my heart pounding against my ribs as I searched for something to say. "Alex, I managed, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Nothing about this felt okay, and yet I couldn't deny the way my body had responded, the way I had leaned into the kiss. He turned away, pacing across the room. "No, it's not. It's not okay. I shouldn't have. God." "Ben would kill me if he knew," he muttered, the thought hanging in the air like a dark cloud. At the mention of my son, a cold wave of reality washed over me. This was wrong, so wrong. And yet, the tension between us remained, undeniable and unrelenting. "Alex," I said gently, trying to steady my voice, "we need to talk about this." He stopped pacing, his shoulders tense as he turned to face me. "What is there to talk about?" he said, his voice laced with frustration and regret. "I crossed a line. I messed up. I'm sorry." I took a step closer, my hands trembling at my sides. "It's not just you," I admitted, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. I felt it too. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the air between us crackled with something unspoken. Then, he shook his head, his expression conflicted. "We can't," he said firmly. "You're Ben's mother. I'm his best friend. Whatever this is, it's not supposed to happen." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it already has." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alex sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. I wanted to say something, anything that might make this easier. But the truth was, I didn't know how to navigate this either. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "What do we do now?" I sat down beside him, careful to leave some space between us. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to figure it out." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't want to lose this," he said softly. "Not just whatever this is, but you, your friendship, your trust. I don't want to ruin everything." His words hit me hard, and I felt a pang of guilt for putting him in this position. Alex had always been like family, someone I could rely on and trust. And yet, here we were, standing on the edge of something that could destroy all of that. "You're not going to lose me," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens, we'll figure this out." He leaned into my touch, his body relaxing slightly under my hand. "You mean that?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I mean it," I said firmly. "But we have to be careful. This isn't just about us, it's about Ben too." At the mention of my son, Alex nodded, his expression somber. "You're right," he said. "We can't let him find out. It would destroy him." The weight of that, truth settled over us, a stark reminder of just how precarious our situation was. But even as we sat there, wrapped in silence. I couldn't ignore the way my hand lingered on his shoulder, or the way his body seemed to lean into mine. The air between us was charged, every unspoken word hanging heavy in the silence. Hours passed, and the tension between us didn't ease. We talked in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant. But no matter how hard we tried to rationalize it, the pull between us remained, undeniable and unrelenting. Alex didn't seem to have to leave anymore, and we talked for hours. Sometimes we touched, a fleeting brush of hands or a lingering glance, but neither of us dared to cross any more lines. Still, there was a certain tension between us, a charge that filled the room and hinted at the unspoken desires simmering beneath the surface. As the clock ticked past midnight, Alex stood, his movements hesitant. "I should go," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I stood too, following him to the door. "Take care of yourself," I said, my chest tightening. As he reached for the handle, he paused, turning to look at me one last time. "You too," he said, his eyes searching mine. "And thank you for not hating me." I managed a small smile. "There's nothing to hate, Alex. Just be careful, okay?" He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment before he stepped out into the night. As the door closed behind him, I leaned against it, my mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that might still happen. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. The way he looked at me, the way we kissed, the way we touched each other, it was a connection too strong to ignore. He had awakened something in me, a longing I hadn't felt in years. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that I wanted more. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I couldn't untangle them. I went through the motions, work, errands, the occasional phone call from Ben, but my thoughts were consumed by that night, by him. Alex. I told myself it would pass, that this was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his hand lingering against mine. The weight of it all was suffocating, and yet I couldn't bring myself to let go. It was late on a Thursday when the knock came at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Ben was still out of town. My heart jumped at the sound, a mix of anxiety and hope rushing through me. When I opened the door, there he was. "Alex, I shouldn't be here," he said, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. Before I could say anything, he continued, "I know I shouldn't, but I couldn't stay away." The sight of him standing there, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination, left me speechless. I stepped aside wordlessly, inviting him in. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said as he stood in the entryway, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt the air leave my lungs. "Alex, we talked about this. It's complicated." "I know," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I know it's complicated, and I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change how I feel. I don't know how to make it stop." I wanted to tell him that he wasn't alone, that I had been feeling the same way, but the words hadn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. He flinched at the touch, but he didn't pull away. "Alex," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, "we can't keep doing this." "I know," he repeated, his gaze finally lifting to meet mine. "But it's not that easy, is it? If it were, I wouldn't be here." His honesty left me raw, stripped of any defenses I might have tried to put up. I stepped closer, my hand still on his arm. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "But this, whatever this is, it can't go any further." His shoulders slumped, and I saw the weight of my words settle over him. "I don't know if I can stop feeling this way," he said quietly. "Neither could I, but I didn't say it. We ended up in the living room again, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, like we had the last time. The space between us felt like a chasm, impossible to bridge without falling into the same mistakes. "I've known you for so long," Alex said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You've always been this constant in my life, someone I could trust, someone who cared. And somewhere along the way, that turned into this." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. "I care about you too, Alex. But this is dangerous. It could ruin everything." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I know. I don't want to ruin anything, but I also don't want to pretend like this doesn't exist." The room felt unbearably quiet, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. I wanted to say something, to find the right words to make this easier, but nothing came. "I should go?" he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Alex," I started, but he interrupted, standing abruptly. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice laced with pain. "Not if it means feeling like this and not being able to do anything about it." I stood too, my heart racing as he turned to leave. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" "I don't want you to go," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know what to do about this either, but I don't want you to leave." He turned slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. "You mean that?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, I do." The tension in the room shifted, the air between us crackling with unspoken possibilities. He took a hesitant step toward me, his eyes searching mine for permission, for reassurance. "I don't want to make things harder," he said softly. "But being here, being around you, it feels right. Even when I know it shouldn't." My resolve crumbled at his words, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. My hand found his, and he laced his fingers through mine, his touch both tentative and certain. "We're playing with fire," I said, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But it doesn't feel wrong, not to me." The hours that followed were a blur of whispered confessions and stolen moments. We didn't cross any more lines, not really, not yet. But the connection between us deepened, growing into something that felt impossible to ignore. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the living room, we sat together on the couch, his head resting against my shoulder. Neither of us spoke, but the silence felt comfortable, like a truce. I knew this wasn't sustainable, that we couldn't keep walking this line without it breaking. But for now, at this moment, I let myself lean into it, knowing that the real world would come crashing in soon enough. After a long moment of silence, Alex said, "Mrs. Anderson, I'm going to be honest with you. I really like you, and I don't want to hide it anymore. I'm still not sure how you feel about it, but I really need to get this off my chest." In that moment, the tension shifted immediately. I felt a surge of excitement go through me. Alex had put himself in such a vulnerable position, confessing his feelings so openly. "Alex," I said, my voice filled with warmth and affection. "I'm so happy you're finally telling me this. I've been feeling the same way. You attract me a lot. You're such a smart, handsome, and good-looking young man. It really excites me." I didn't get to finish my sentence. He grabbed me, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was a lot deeper, more passionate than before. It was like a dam had broken, a flood of emotions unleashed. The kiss deepened, and after a minute of heavy kissing, his hands started to explore, touching me in places that made my breath catch. I loved it. I let it all happen. The age difference didn't matter. This was pure desire. As the kiss deepened, his hands moved with a newfound confidence, exploring every curve and contour of my body. His touch ignited a fire within me, a longing I hadn't felt in years. I moaned softly, arching into him, wanting to get closer. His lips were so masculine yet so soft that it drove me crazy. It went from bad to worse, and we did everything you can imagine. After we both finished, we lay there in each other's arms, the silence filled with the echoes of our passion. It didn't take long before Alex fell asleep. He must have been exhausted. A moment later, I dozed off too. A couple of hours later, as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the living room, the weight of what we'd shared settled over us. Alex shifted slightly, his head still resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I allowed myself to revel in the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand lightly brushed mine. It was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with the implications of what we'd done. Eventually, Alex stirred, lifting his head and rubbing his eyes. "I should go," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion, "before Ben comes back." I nodded, knowing he was right, but feeling the ache of the impending distance between us. "Yeah, that's probably best." He stood and stretched, the light catching his face in a way that made my chest tighten. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a mixture of guilt and longing that mirrored my own. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but instead, he just gave me a small, sad smile. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not pushing me away." I stood too, running a hand through my hair as I tried to find the right words. "Alex, this..."
Subscribe to my channel.